Hello everybody, I am Skorch13 and welcome to my card review for Resurgence Part 2, Faeria's current expansion that just released today, Tuesday, October 23rd. Of course, Part 2 is mainly centered around blue and green cards because we got yellow and red all in Part 1. We of course do have neutrals thrown in there as well, and I am very excited for some of the cards that are coming out. Just to kind of go along with the same type of formatting, my card review is generally looking at how I think cards will either fit into an archetype that currently exists, or whether a certain card or combination of cards that are being released will give life to either a new archetype or bring back one that we've seen in the past. It's not going to be strictly, from a balance perspective, it's not going to be strictly kind of a ranking the cards, whether I think they are, on a star scale or out of 10 or something like that. It's purely based on whether I see them kind of finding a home, whether it's in competitive or for ladder play. Also going to be a little bit different this time around because I'm going to be trying to do it basically from within the game client itself rather than going through the cards pulled from the Resurgence Reveal website. I'm still going to kind of follow the same pattern, but it will be shown like this directly from the game client itself. So let's get right at it. Llama Corn, as shown here, is the first card that we're going to look at. It is a 5/5 Faeria beast with combat, basically similar to Storyteller, except you draw one card instead of two. Does have the life gain on there. Immediate impression was actually very interested in this card because we have Beast synergy in the game. We have Green Blue Beast, which has been around for a little while now, and of course uses the card Hunt Down, which allows you to fight. So you can trigger this combat effect right off the bat. We also had some Red Beast synergy come out in Part 1 of Resurgence with the Beast Trainer and the Hippo being a beast as well. Looks like maybe Green-Red Beasts was trying to be pushed a little more. That also opens up something like the Grappling Hook. Again, gives the ranged, which could allow you to trigger this combat effect fairly easily. Beast Trainer also fits really well with Llama Corn because the 5 Faeria discount gives this right down to 0. It hits it perfectly for that. I'll say problem with this card, or kind of seeing it probably not either fit into a beast deck that currently exists or bring about a new beast type deck, is generally this isn't really a combat ability that you want to have trigger. There's not a lot of times where it's like, all right, I need this type of effect to really gain a lot of value. That being said, there may be some sort of defensive deck that comes about that once your opponent's putting pressure on, you can actually use the Llama Corn and certain other things that exist currently to actually stabilize your defenses and start a comeback from there. The card itself, I think, is actually really good. The combat effect just doesn't have a lot of perfect uses, if that kind of makes the most sense. It just doesn't give a lot of value in terms of kind of tempo onto the board, plus the fact that your opponent gets that value as well. If you're behind and they're attacking into the Llama Corn, you give them that same advantage. Another thing that kind of backfires with this card is actually combat currently occurs when you attack into the orb as well. So it's not like you can even play Llama Corn as an aggressive creature, because once you attack, it's going to deal that 5 damage, but then it's actually going to heal your opponent for 2 life because of the combat ability. So you're really only dealing 3 damage a turn. I just don't really see this kind of fitting into one of those beast decks that already exists. And it doesn't really take the place of anything that currently exists either, that you can go, no, this is strictly better than a card that's already in one of those decks. Next up, we have the Sky Yak. I really like that they did Sky Yak because, of course, this was a art that was used on a card before, the card that has now become Swarming Chrysalis, the card that once it dies, it continues to make more copies of itself when you play the next copy of that card. Sky Yak is actually really interesting to me. We get more Yak synergy, of course. We also have some neutral synergy because this gains 2/2 while you control 6 prairies. That makes it a 4 Faeria 4/6, which is really strong. Currently, the base stat, something like a Tyrannax, if you want to look at it that way, is a 5 Faeria 4/6. This card actually, 5 Faeria 4/6. This card actually gains flying on top of being 1 Faeria cheaper if you do have that 6 prairies. Now, while a neutral deck doesn't really, I won't say exist, but exists at a competitive tier right now, neutral's always been something that some people try to toy with here and there just because you can extend lands way faster than your opponent. Try to get creatures out on the board, land block your opponent, and then really just control what they're able to do on the board. The problem with the Over Sky Yak not fitting into that type of strategy is it still does have 1 wild land requirement. Now, the benefit here is that if you wanted to play other Yaks, something like the Ruby Yak for some of like the burn synergy, where you're able to deal that directly to your opponent's orb while having pretty strong statted Yak creatures on the board. If you want to play it with something like the Sapphire Yaks and actually control the board that way and get more and more buffs on your Over Sky Yak, all of the Yaks, the main Yaks that we have there, actually only cost 1 of their respective land. Ruby Yak, 1 mountain, Sapphire Yak, 1 lake, just like I mentioned there. So you can actually play through mainly neutrals and then a Yak card, whatever that land needs to be. Over Sky Yak actually fits perfectly into that type of synergy. Definitely could see it seeing play. It just really depends on what ends up being kind of the best use for it. I definitely could see something like not mono red, but something like a neutral red. We've had an agri red, maybe Steamforge Enforcer comes back in, and you get that kind of red rush style, where you have neutrals to extend quickly at your opponent, some low-cost Axe Grinder, Ruby Yak, and then whenever you need the second mountain for something like the Kobold War Beast, also a Yak, and then Over Sky Yak in there as well. Definitely it is an archetype that I could see fitting this card into. It just really depends on if that one comes to the forefront. Because the other rushes that we have right now in the game, especially with Green Rush starting to come back really to the forefront of the meta. I'm also going to touch on Blue Rush later on in this video because of some of the cards that are coming out. So I don't know that Red Rush is going to be at the forefront of the meta, but with all of the nerfs that Red has seen to Red Control, Red Combat, I think as far as Mono Red is concerned, some form of that Red Rush actually could be one of the top tier for a Mono Red. Next up, we have the Roaming Yak. 2 Faeria 1/1, we have the neutral version of an Explorer, essentially, because we have Gift Create a Prairie. And then you have the dash as well, so you can actually dash onto that prairie. Of course, we have the Yak synergy as well in there, so certain things like extending lands very early on, getting out onto the wells and playing something like a Sapphire Yak can buff this little guy up to a 3/3. Fairly efficient stat line from there. Creating a prairie generally doesn't have too much value unless you're using a deck that really needs land positioning. Something like green for Sagami Grove Caller, getting forests into the right position. Of course, now we have new teleport cards as well that I'll touch on later. Red really needs it for things like Bomb Slinger, or even just as far as creatures are concerned with like taunt positioning. So the kind of problem with that is that the Yak doesn't really fit into any of those archetypes. And I don't see something like the Create a Prairie being a neutral deck back to the forefront. Now, because we are kind of getting some of these more Yaks into the game, there definitely could be a Yak deck that comes back about. And I'm actually going to push from here right onto the next card as well, Yak Shepherd, because this all kind of rolls into one. Yak Shepherd is a 3 Faeria 2/3, 3 wild land costs, so if you're going for a whole bunch of different Yaks, of course just need potentially one of each of those colors, and then you play the Yak Shepherd on top. Give 2 friendly Yaks plus 2/0 and charge 2, now very important because the Yaks do really lack mobility. And if you're able to use something like the Roaming Yak to continue to make prairies, then you're actually able to extend lands and use that charge 2 properly, potentially to its fullest. I really like this card for a Yak archetype, and I actually think this could be one of those kind of control tools that the deck actually needs to get your creatures into the right positions. You currently only have the Azure Yak, Topaz Yak, not Azure. Topaz Yak, which is the yellow one, as a haste creature. That's kind of the only removal that currently runs in Yak decks. So the fact that you could get the extra attack and the extra mobility means you can actually put your Yaks into the right positions to get trays. Now again, that charge 2 potentially sets you up for a good Sapphire Yak collection, another proc on that. We have the Oversky Yak. It has flying. You're able to give it flying in charge 2. Now it is only until the end of turn, but something like that is a 4/6 with flying. Suddenly that's a 6/6 with charge 2. Very, very interesting. Roaming Yak does fit in the deck as well because you can then create prairies. If you're playing Yak Shepherd, you need to get more special lands out if you're playing all these different kinds of Yaks. So that extra prairie is actually very important to extend your lands as well. So I think, as far as kind of all of the things coming together, this could be where we see a Yak deck, certainly not at the top of the competitive meta, but at least at a playable level on ladder. It's one that I'm very interested in because of the actual control that the Yak Shepherd gives. All right, following up with that, we get into the legendaries. We have our first one, Bannon, Captain of the Radiance, a card that I am super, super interested in, which is a 7 Faeria 4/5, fairly high cost for what it does. But gift, if you have no creatures left in your deck, shuffle Radiance, Imperial Airship, which I believe is the old one. The new one is called Scourge of Oversky, I believe. But so that is Radiance, which has the gift of healing you for however many cards you have in hand, as well as 10 random neutral creatures into your deck. They gain +2/2. Now, at the time that I'm recording this, which is on release day, that's currently bugged, but will be fixed, I believe they said tomorrow. So two very interesting uses for Bannon, I think, that at least are within my thought for seeing him be played, as well as what I've seen pop up within the community since he was revealed. One is playing some kind of control, not necessarily fatigue style deck, but just a control deck that wants to basically starve out your opponent, and if it goes into the end game, so be it. And then you play Bannon at the end when you and your opponent both have very little resources left. You refill your deck to anti-fatigue yourself so you don't die to that fatigue damage, as well as you have all of these extra creatures at the end when you can gain more value from them. Now, the other deck, the other archetype that I've seen discussed, and the one that I think actually has quite a bit of merit to it, is actually playing some sort of event-heavy deck that then plays Bannon, because whenever you draw him, you can get him out onto the board. Now, that style currently almost exists with the blue-yellow that we've seen in competitive recently. You run things like Battle Toads, Flight of the Mantas, and Spell Whirls, giving you extra ways to not only create creature advantage onto the board, but also card advantage, because you're creating extra cards through each of these cards. Of course, Flight of the Mantis copies itself. Battletoads gives you 2 creatures on the board for the price of 1 card. And Spell Whirl can be any number of things that are usually good enough to be played, especially when you're not running any other creatures. That type of a deck needs some holes filled, I'll say. But you can also use something like Time of Legends to tutor Bannon whenever you draw it, basically giving you 2 chances at it. And the fact that you get random cards can have upsides, can have downsides, but the fact that they're all +2/2 means you're always gaining value for the stats that you're getting onto the board. There are certain, odd cases where that isn't necessarily true. Something like Royal Judge is still only a 3/3 for 5, but you get a free card out of it, so you get more value than you normally would for that card. Downside to that is you do have to pay 7 for Bannon. Potentially, if it is blue-yellow that we see him end up in, maybe it's something like Failed Experiment, and you don't actually need the body of Bannon, but 2 Failed Experiments ends up being a free card. 1, he ends up costing 4. So, if you value the gift more than the body, there are ways to cheat that out. One of the other things that I could see kind of slotting into that is something like an Aurora's Creation onto him. As long as he survives the turn that you play him, play Aurora's Creation, then you're basically just going to play the rest of the game out with your neutral creatures, and at the end, play another Bannon. Something you would have to keep in mind there is playing all of the neutrals first and not forgetting how many are in the deck before playing the second one. But this is definitely a card that potentially gives life to a new archetype. Like I mentioned, it potentially slots into some kind of control-y deck that sometimes goes to fatigue and you just want to play him for extra resources at the end of the game. But I definitely think the event-style deck is much more likely for Bannon to see play. All right, final one in the neutrals is Ulani, Defender of Oversky. Very, very interesting little card here. 2 Faeria, 2/4. If it's the only creature, if it's your only creature, gains Taunt, Protection, and Divine. So, right off the bat, if you're able to get all of those onto it, quite obviously you are gaining a lot of value for this creature. It is Rakuen, so that Rakuen-style synergy potentially comes into effect, although it does have Divine, so of course there is some downside to that. Even though it does stop your opponent from being able to target it, it does stop yourself from being able to target it as well. The 4 Wildlands I don't think impacts it that much, just because of the fact a lot of Rakuen-style decks are going to be running a lot of different lands, because you need to get to the two lands in one thing, 2 lands in another, or 1 in 1, and you're still playing 4 colors, anything along those lines where you're running a lot of different things. I also believe the Rakuen Champion, which is kind of the end game card for the Rakuen style decks, is 3 wild. I could be wrong on that, but I believe it's 3. So you're usually getting up to that stage where I don't think the 4 wildlands here actually impacts it that much. Big thing here is how much of a comeback card Ulani can actually be. If your opponent has destroyed all your creatures on one side of the board, you can flip sides, play Ulani in a more protected position. Your opponent can't target because of the Divine. And then you're looking at not only a cheap collector that is also durable enough to survive AoE and anything like that, you're also getting it at 2 costs. So the fact that the turn you play it, you save potentially 1 Faeria, or you save +1, so you save 2 Faeria. You save yourself from using +1 on the power wheel, so you get potentially 2 Faeria saved that way, and then you can snowball that into collection. I actually see Ulani being a pretty interesting either comeback card on a board state where you're behind, or kind of more of a snowball in your direction on an equal board state late in the game, where you're constantly trading on one side. You've just made a trade, then you play Ulani. That's another big thing, is that it just has to be if Ulani is your only creature when you play it. You can play Ulani and then something else, and you still actually gain the gift ability and start to snowball Faeria collection from there. One of the interesting things we will get to a little later, there is a new Rakuen out that I think could be really good with this as well, which is the new Priest. Of course, gives 2/4. We'll talk about that when we get to it, but I think is actually a really good one that could hit Ulani as well, making it a really big creature onto the board that is just almost impossible for your opponent to deal with, and then you really snowball an advantage. I think the Rakuen deck is still lacking a little bit, but I definitely think that Ulani is a very good piece coming into it. although legendary, so you do only get one copy, unlike the Yak Shepherd, which I just touched on, giving a lot of control ability to Yak type decks. Ulani doesn't give the same impact to Rakuen type decks. All right, getting into the blue cards next, since we are following along with the Resurgence reveal site. Bloated Toad, this is one of the ones that we actually saw quite early on in terms of the reveals, because it was on one of the Steam pictures, the Steam store page pictures. Bloated Toad is a 1 Faeria 3/3, of course very overstated, so what's the downside? Downside here is last word, summon a 2/2 frog with jump for your opponent in this space. It has jump itself, so that means you can get very good early control, but when this dies, when it trades into something, your opponent's going to get a 2/2 in its spot. Kind of the offset. My first impressions of this were actually that it's a pretty strong card, because as blue, and specifically with blue jump, you generally have a board state advantage early on. So if you can use something like a Humbling Vision, like a Frogify, potentially like the Lookingglass Phantasm that we're going to get to a few cards from now, you can use that control play to set up a good, efficient clear with the Toad, and then have a creature in behind that then jumps forward and kills the 2/2 that your opponent normally would have left. It's not perfect per se, because you could have something like Water Elemental in this spot, also a 3/3, and that 2 damage that you would be doing to the next creature would have to be more valuable than the 3 Faeria difference between Water Elemental and Bloated Toad. Now, that's not exactly perfect, because the Water Elemental also creates the lake. But big thing here is this is also a Triton. So the Triton synergy, which we're now seeing introduced with Part 2 of Resurgence, that type of deck, you get extra value that way. I think this is a pretty swingy card, because if you get it later on when it can get cleared right away, you lose a lot of value, because you just essentially give your opponent a 2/2. But I think early on, when you can set up trades and then immediately kill the 2/2, I think it definitely could be worth seeing play. Potentially we see some kind of blue-red come about, where you are playing this as a control tool, trading into that, and then using something like a Cypher's Wrath to kill off the frog, and you're dealing that extra burn damage. It's an archetype that has seen some play recently. I forget who it was who I was just watching recently was playing a... might have been from the Open last weekend, the first of the Cyphers Open. There was a red-blue, looked kind of mid-rangey, but it was a very aggressive, and I can't recall exactly the details of it. But that potentially is a style that we could see. You, of course, have Gemshell, which is still a very strong card, and red-blue has been played on ladder and in competitive for quite a while. Potentially that's some type of synergy that we could see come about from this type of a card. All right, continuing along with the Triton synergy, we also have Tidelord, another creature that was revealed again in that Steam store picture like I mentioned. 5 Faeria 5/5 with jump, pretty average stats. Can be summoned adjacent to friendly Tritons. If it is, this gets +1/1. So one of those snowball style cards where if you already have a creature on board, this gains more stats. You're able to move it into a really good position. Play the Tidelord, similar to, I believe it's Kalim's Skyguard, which exists in yellow. Same thing, you can summon it adjacent. This one, of course, just has to be summoned on a land. But if you're able to jump into an aggressive position with one of your other creatures, play the Tidelord, and then get that trade, you end up with a really strong, aggressive creature. One of the archetypes that I'm actually really interested in is more of a mid-range, potentially not Triton blue, but not really sure even what to call it right now, but running things like Ancient Herald, the new Phantasm, potentially the Bloated Toad that we just looked at, but Tidelord as well. We'll have to get some other Tritons in there to ensure that the synergy happens with this type of a card, but if you're able to get something like Ancient Herald discounts onto this, it's incredibly strong for the value. Of course, we have Aurora's Creation, which you could also play in a Triton-style deck. Tidlord comes right down to a 0 cost. You just continue cycling through some very, very powerful cards. I don't know if that just replaces the blue jump that currently exists, because Tidlord is a 4 land requirement, and a lot of what the current blue jump wants to do is much quicker than what Tidlord would actually come down onto the board as. However, that style of deck sometimes does like to just control the first 3-4 turns of the game. Once you get something like Triton Warrior down, jump forward, contest their first creature, play something else, contest their second creature, play something else, and then start to push that advantage. So Tidlord definitely can find a home in that archetype, just because by the time it comes down, when you hit that 4 land requirements, you're actually potentially still fighting for the early board control, and a 6/6 can be very difficult at that stage of the game. I think it's definitely potential in both current blue jump and any type of blue Triton deck that comes about, which may just be a mashup combination of the two that becomes the new dominant blue. But I think this is potentially one of the stronger cards of Part 2. I don't want to say strongest, because I am very intrigued by a lot of the cards that are being released. Of course, we have brand new only green and blue. So even though those cards have been kind of not necessarily fading fully from the meta, because blue is still right at the forefront, I think the green does have some things that push back. But this one definitely is one of the ones that I can see having one of the higher presence of the Part 2 cards. Up next is Animated Banquet. This is actually one of the only other cards that I saw ahead of it being revealed on release day today. It was one of the cards that I was actually given a choice of for my card reveal, which came out last week. 2 Faeria, 2/2. 1 late cost, you can get it very early in the game, and has -1. At the end of your turn, a random adjacent friendly creature swallows this and gains +1/1. Now, at first glance, I was, like I said, saw this ahead of time and thought, no, it doesn't really look as interesting to me. And then I saw some of the work that it can do when played by watching some people streaming today. The -1 is very important because you can put it into the right position to get onto the right creature. Swallow is still impactful enough in the meta that this dodges those swallow creatures. And the other big thing is that it basically turns your creature into something that survives. It gives that extra last words, essentially, to a creature, as well as the buff. So you can look at it in terms of, first off, of course, being a 2/2 for 2 is basically equal statted. And once it gives its ability, it's a campfire. And it's also the last words of coming back onto the board, so it can be another campfire or collection. There's a lot of things that can go very, very right for Animated Banquet. I don't even want to say kind of downside for this card, but the potential things that can go wrong with it, because it's only 1 lake, it can sometimes come down before all of your other creatures, and that gives your opponent the chance to respond. Something like a Soul Drain or Cypher's Wrath clears this off very efficiently. But once you can get this rolling onto the board, if you're able to either dictate trades or dictate where your creatures are spawning around the banquet to then dictate the buffs, I think it's actually very difficult for your opponent to deal with this. The fact that you can get it over and over again, really, it's almost in the same way that Runen used to be, where you would just, buff after buff after buff and control the board through there, and your opponent's just, wasting Faeria to try to keep up with that creature. Animated Banquet may be one of, I don't even want to say the sleepers, because I think it's actually being rated fairly highly right off the bat. But there's a lot of decks that are going to want to use this for blue. Not only for blue, but for something like green-blue, your creatures are generally a little smaller. Sometimes they need that little oomph to get the 1/1. Now, it is end of turn, so your opponent does have that first chance to respond to it and potentially clear it off. But if you're able to kind of build around where Animated Banquet's going to spawn, I think it's very difficult for your opponent to punch through and actually kill this off. You're just able to gather so much value from it. Next up is Triton Tactician. 3 Faeria 2/4 with jump. Again, we have that Triton synergy, something that's really being pushed in part 2 of Resurgence because it is a brand new subtype. Well, I shouldn't say brand new. The subtype has been out for a while, but now we actually have cards that benefit from that subtype. Gains +1/0 for each adjacent friendly Triton. So again, we're looking at board positioning being very impactful here. But even if you get just one buff out of this, it's already worth some value to you. I think generally you want to get 2. 4/4 is a very big stat point. 3 attack does have things that it's very good into, but generally if you have it as 2, it's going to be your removal essentially for clearing off creatures that have already value traded. If it gets to 3, it kind of ends up in a land where sometimes it can clear a creature, sometimes it's used to kill something off, but 4/4 generally clears or at least trades into a lot of things very efficiently. We, of course, have jump again, similar to all Tritons, so you're able to push up the board very quickly and get that Tide Lord in behind everybody. I think, like I mentioned with Tide Lord, that the kind of Triton blue jump is going to be one that's very strong. We already have Triton Warrior, which exists in current blue jump, and you basically would replace these with everything. I believe Triton Trainer, oh yeah, of course that has Triton in the name. Triton Trainer, of course, is a Triton as well, so that fits into the blue jump. If you can get any of those buffs onto any of these creatures, they become even more powerful. It's a deck that snowballs very quickly, what we see of current blue jump, and I believe what we'll continue to see with Triton blue jump. All right, Coral Polliwog, one of the ones I believe we saw the banner art for already released in a Faeria Friday, but is a card that was just revealed on release day today. 7 Faeria 5/7, pretty heavy cost. Beast, of course we have that Beast synergy coming through. Looks like it would stay more towards the green-blue archetype that already exists because of Hunt Down. This ends up being really, really high statted. It becomes a 7/7 if you choose to play Hunt Down on it. Can clear a lot of things off as well as being tanky enough to survive and potentially get a second trade afterwards. It has a mini haste, I want to call it, because it can collect on the turn you play it. So if you play it on a well, it's actually a 6 Faeria 5/7, which is really good for the stats. Actually, I shouldn't say really good. It's pretty good for the stats. We have the, of course, baseline being Verteron Force, which is a 6 Faeria 7/7. So, you don't get exactly the right things, but key thing to this card is that the gift of you may move this creature's land actually ends up being really good to potentially get into collection positions. Downside here is that it does cost so much. So unless you're going for Lake Explore Lake Polliwog and then dash between and start neutral or double collecting with a 5/7, I think you're generally a little shy on Faeria, or you'd rather play more creatures out or a control tool. There's not a lot of times where you can use this as a sort of comeback mechanic. Even though it does collect on the turn that you play it, you still need that 7 Faeria initially to actually play it onto the board. I mentioned the Beast synergy. I don't necessarily see this fitting into any type of green-blue beast that already exists. And if you're running it in a red-blue beast, for example, potentially there just isn't enough to sustain that. If you're running red-blue, you're probably running something that's pretty heavy cost already, like Gemshell, or even Triton trainers, Beast trainers in there. Even though you do get those discounts to start rolling, you need to start somewhere. And if everything in your hand is too high cost to actually play onto the board, you're going to fall behind very quickly, and you don't really have a lot of good comeback in that type of a deck. I'm really interested to see if Coral Polliwog can find a home in some type of deck, because I think it is really good in terms of what it can provide. It just needs the next follow-up, or it needs you to constantly stay ahead. And if you're already ahead, it may just be a type of deck that doesn't need this type of card, because you'd rather play something else and continue the pressure rather than kind of resetting with the Polliwog. All right, finally, Lookingglass Phantasm, card that was revealed on the Krogcast, a card that also changed between its initial reveal and the final form. 5 Faeria, 3/5 creature, it costs 5 lakes now. Transform an enemy creature into a 5/3. I think we're going to basically condense this down to LGP, or just call it Phantasm, which really sucks because Mirror Phantasm already exists, so it can be very confusing in terms of actually saying card names during play. I'm really disappointed they stuck with the actual true backwards Lookingglass Phantasm wording, because my thoughts were, it's a game, right? Like, you already have things that you've made up Tritons, you've made up Tikis. They could have made something up for this, just called it something interesting, but that's, you know, very, very minor detail on the card. This is kind of what I was talking about with the Bloated Toad as well. Because you're going to turn the opponent's creature into a 5/3, you can then trade with the Bloated Toad, potentially have something else to follow up and kill off the frog that's left behind. Gives you a very good control tool. However, I don't know that because it's transform an enemy creature, I don't know that it ever just replaces Frogify. Very interested when this card was revealed, like I mentioned, to trying out some kind of a blue mid-range where you're running, again, Ancient Heralds, basically hitting with the potential to hit almost anything in the deck. That turns Lookingglass Phantasm into a 3-cost, 3/5 X removal. The 5/3 that you're transforming the opponent's creature into still dies to Ancient Herald, leaving you with a 5/1 in behind. Potentially that's very easy to clear up, but you've maybe already got enough value out of that transformation. You also have early things like Water Elemental, or even Triton Warrior, depending on what the card that your opponent played was. Most of the time, Humbling Vision does the same thing, but the fact that you get an extra creature maybe offsets that. Very interested to see if this finds a home in some kind of Dreamweaver list, because that is already so heavy going into lake requirements. You have Forbidden Libraries, which hit the same lake requirement as the Phantasm here, and then you again want to push lands as quick as possible. Having this type of a control tool potentially fits in something like that. The downside to that is you potentially end up with dead hands, where you have something like Dreamweaver's Phantasm, Libraries, maybe even Radiance in hand, and you actually can't play it because everything costs so much. I'm very interested still, even though it was changed. The land requirement was nerfed from its initial form, and you can only use it on enemy creature rather than being able to use it on one of your own creature for a transformation effect. I'm still very interested to see how this Phantasm fits into some control style decks, especially Dreamweaver. I think it does have usefulness. I don't want to just say that, you know, before it was even released, it's been nerfed into the ground. I don't think it'll find a home in a lot of decks just because of that land requirement. You basically can't play it in dual color decks now. And there aren't too many other kind of blue control that want to go past. You know, maybe there's a Dream list that comes back around, but I think Dreamweaver is definitely the archetype that'll want to use Phantasm, and then it's just a matter of if it's good enough to see play in that type of a deck. All right, next we're on to Victory Celebration, the one that was just revealed yesterday by Werfs. For the rest of the game, each player gains 1 extra Faeria each turn. It is a 1 lake, 1 forest, and 2 wild, so it has to come down kind of mid-game. Big downside here is that you give it to your opponent first. Upside being that it does cost 0, so it's not like it costs you anything to give your opponent 1 Faeria. My real thought on this, I'm intrigued by it, but I don't know if it's good enough because you're giving your opponent that first advantage. Player 1 advantage, of course, in card games in general, but also in Faeria, is actually pretty big. They have 3 Faeria, then you have 3 Faeria. Then they go first with that type of advantage. The Explorer card does help even that out a little bit because it, on whatever turn you choose to use it, is 2 extra Faeria for you to catch up. But Victory Celebration, if you are player 2, means the first turn that after you've played it, your opponent has 4 Faeria advantage, and then you catch up with 4 Faeria. So if your opponent is able to use that 1 extra Faeria in a good way, they always stay ahead from that position, I think. It also feels a bit like a win more card, because if you're ahead and you play this, then you have more extra Faeria to stay on board. I do think it kind of works if you're player 1, just because you give your opponent 1 Faeria first, but you're already ahead by that natural 3 of the way that the game works. So you're kind of only giving them like a 2 Faeria close the gap type of thing, because it's like you've played 3 Faeria, then they've played 3, then you've played 3, but then they've played 4, and then you play 4, so it kind of swings the 1 that way. But again, that still just feels like a win more to me. Also, going for green-blue, you don't have a great event synergy. If you want to play something like Snowstorm Lancer, potentially you can go for, Snowstorm Lancer and the Fairies, and you're looking at green buffs, blue control, and then Victory Celebration does fit in as an event into that style. But I don't necessarily think that that's a style that needs this type of a card in it. So currently, I don't really see a home for this, and I just don't see it creating something new. All right, Savior of the Meek. Very happy that I opened this in a Mythic, because it's very fitting, because this was the card that I actually revealed last week. I'm not going to go too in-depth on this, because if you want, you can go check out my card reveal video, which is also posted on our YouTube channel. About a 6-minute video there that you can see my thoughts on the Savior of the Meek. But I'm very interested to see what type of style this comes into, because it gives the +2/2 in Divine to a friendly creature with exactly 1 attack. I immediately thought of something like an enchantment style deck. You're running Living Willows, potentially something like Shadow Silk or Flower Silk Fairy. Wandering Monk can be very good to give it Divine and then just sit it off in a corner while you continue to draw cards. Slowly work its way up the board and hit your opponent for a bunch of damage. Also, really cool that it can target another copy of itself, because it has that 1 attack. You can play a Savior onto something and then play another Savior onto the first one and just start to kind of snowball control from there. I really, really am interested to see 2 things from this. 1, green-blue enchant potentially coming back into the meta, and 2, if we see a new kind of build to the green-blue, more swarm-style decks that run Frog Tossers, Gift to the Rakoa, that type of thing. But again, you can go see kind of my full thoughts on that on the reveal video. All right, green is up next, and we start with the Verteron Emissary, what probably will be the best card released in Part 2, because it gives new life to mono green. Of course, not by itself, but it's a 5 Faeria for 5. 1 land requirement here means you can go as player 2, explore Forest Verteron Emissary very early on. Already pretty good stats for the 5 cost out of 4/5. And last words, give +1/1 to all creatures in your hand. The greens that we've been seeing a lot recently are Green Rush and Beastmaster Green. Beastmaster Green or a green mid-range is where this is really going to find its home. The extra buffs can be very similar to Aerodon if you want to kind of think of it that way, but you get a more immediate impact because it's just the ones in hand. You don't have to wait to essentially draw them later on, and you actually get a body that is decent enough for early fights. One kind of downside here is you do want it to die, so you don't really want to use buffs onto a card that you want to die. Kind of a weird way to phrase that, but early on in the game, you'd essentially want to play this, get a decent trade, and then start flooding the board with your buffed creatures. I think this is a really strong card. Beastmaster Green is a very interesting one because the Beastmasters, with the buff from Verteron Emissary, can then buff themselves. Current stat line for them is a 3/4. With the 1/1, they'll go to a 4/5. And Beastmasters give +1/1 to anything, any creature you summon which has 5 or more life. That means each of your Beastmasters will buff the others, and you snowball control very quickly in that type of an archetype. I think this is definitely a card that not necessarily brings back a mono green, but really reinforces the mono greens that we have. All right, Blossoming Kodama comes up next. 6 Faeria, 5/7, 5 forests, and gift create 3 forests. It is late game land ramp. And although it doesn't say it, this card does function as create 3 forests at random. You cannot choose where they go. 2 big points to this one is for something like a big green, running Oak Fathers, running Primeval Colossus. This is a fantastic card because your Wood Elementals ramp you early up to 5, which you always want to get to for things like Therian Golem or Feed the Forests. And then once you're there, if you don't have one of those cards in hand, Kodama ramps you the rest of the way to either get a giant Oak Father down or a very discounted Primeval Colossus. Big problem with that deck is it is very Faeria average costly. You're basically looking at a lot of creatures in your deck running at between 5 and 7 playable cost, including the Colossus in there at one of those more discounted costs rather than at its full cost. But you're essentially looking at Therian Golem on 5, probably Grove Guardian on 5, Blossoming Kodama on 6, Oak Father on 7, and then Primeval Colossus at anywhere from 6 to 8-ish. It's potentially a deck that just doesn't even run Verteron Force, just because it needs some smaller stuff to ensure that it can collect. It is a deck that, depending on what you're up against, just absolutely snowballs because your opponent can't touch whatever you're doing. Green has these beefy creatures that almost no matter what are going to get some kind of value trade into whatever your opponent's running. Kind of downside to that is red isn't as prominent in the meta right now. So you don't necessarily need green as much to counter that. And something like the blue that we're probably going to see be very prevalent, the yellow, the potentially blue-yellow, or even green-blue, do have a lot of movement or small stuff to control the board. And then you have removal on top of that as well. So it is an archetype that, if shut down, very much struggles to get back into the game. But I definitely think that it is going to be an archetype that can come back to the front of the meta. Maybe it just potentially is like a tier 2, more played in competitive than on ladder, just because once it gets rolling, it's almost impossible to stop. All right, next we have Priest of Everlife. I very briefly touched on this earlier with the Rakuen synergy like I was talking about. 3 Faeria, 1/1 gift, give the next creature you draw +2/4. A little bit of RNG depending on the way that you draw here. But I'm very interested in this for a couple different things. One, the Rakuen deck, like I talked about earlier, really lacks removal. So getting extra buffs onto your creatures mean you can take different trades than you normally would be able to, and you can continue to control the board that way. Secondly, because it is a 1/1 that essentially already used its ability, this is actually a really good target for the Rakuen Cannoneer. You can use this as a sacrifice, deal 3 damage to something. That gives you a little bit of extra removal in a couple different types of ways. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, also very good if you're able to get that buff onto Ulani, because you're potentially able to use that in a really efficient way. Don't see this being the card, that brings Rakuens up to the front, but it's definitely really, really good. If you can get it down onto something like a Rakuen Champion, that's even more power to your kind of end game card. But just the fact of it's a Elderwood Embrace coupled with a 1/1 creature that can be used in a couple different ways, whether it is that sacrifice like I talked about, or just another creature onto the board, another buff for Gift of the Rakoa or your Rakuen Champion. It's a card that can be very good in pushing Rakoans a little bit into a better state. All right, Chrysalis comes up next. Zero-cost structure, zero-cost cards historically have been a little dicey in Faeria, so we'll have to see how that impacts this card. If it does get very good use, potentially seeing that as a point of nerf in the future. It is a 2-health structure. Gift, swallow a friendly creature. Production, the swallowed creature gains +1/1, and activate, destroy this. So, basically, right off the bat, 1 can be free movement. You can play Chrysalis for 0, swallow creature, immediately activate it because structures are able to do that, and just move the creature to wherever you want. Now, it will lose any buffs that it currently has, but it could heal from that position. You can't collect afterwards. The production, I think, is actually kind of awkward because you don't really want something to be off the board, even though it is free, unless you're already ahead or you're moving into a more protected position, then give it +1/1 and then pop it so you can then collect the next turn. Usually if you want to use that movement defensively, you're going to be using it to just get into a better collection position and not actually for the slow stat gain that this gives. Now, maybe I'm wrong and there's something small going to come about, something even like popping an Ancient Boar in here and then contesting with the rest of your creatures and then pop the Boar out, even at something like a 6/7, 7/8 that then controls the board from there. That generally would lend Chrysalis to be 1, potentially 2 of in a deck, which doesn't make it too consistent either. The one that I'm actually very, very interested to see for Chrysalis, we currently have a green-yellow that exists, more of a mid-range deck. Early Verteron Force into Kaleem's Training, Fanatic, some sort of movement control. You have Lionfish in there and Overgrown Tower as removal. You can have the Swordfish in there as another big creature. I'm really interested to see if that style chooses to play Chrysalis and Doomsday combination as a backup plan. Once your opponent starts to control the board, you pop something like a Verteron Force or maybe an Ancient Boar, something smaller into the Chrysalis, and then pop a Doomsday, removing everything that your opponent has, destroying the creature, and because it was swallowed, it will still spit back out after, and you've essentially protected your creature from getting cleared and gained board control back. It's not perfect, but because that archetype already exists, that is definitely a home that I can see pulling for the Chrysalis. All right, next up we have the 2 newest cards that were revealed on the Krogcast. The final 2 in green and the ones that give it a little more control on the board depending on the green that you want to play. First up, Zephyr Vulpine. Very, very good turn 1 play for green. 3 Faeria, 1 Forest, again means you can play it on turn 1, is a 3/3. Whenever this moves into a forest, you may teleport it to a forest you control. Very important distinction there, it is a forest, not just whenever you move it into one of your forests, teleport it. So you can actually use this on an opponent's forest to run away in certain positions, to reset the board, or maybe dash around and take good trades. It also is set up as a you may teleport, so you can choose to cancel that if you want and stay on the same side of the board or move through a forest to take a potential trade on that side. Very important point to note on this, its collection is based on wherever it lands. So you can't move to a forest that's adjacent to a well, collect, then teleport, move into range of another well and double collect in that same turn. It will proc the teleport before the creature actually lands adjacent to the first well. So does have a little bit, not necessarily less value in that way, but just a little more planning that goes into the card. The fact that it is a beast is pretty good as well. Potentially we could see, I think, a red-green come about. I've mentioned it a couple times throughout this episode, that something like a salamander red-green beasts could actually be really good, because you have a couple new beasts and the beast trainer that was introduced in part 1. Then you also have low cost cards or low requirement cards like the Vulpine. Get a few things onto the board, slam that salamander down for a bunch of buffs. Don't know if it's going to be good enough to replace kind of the current versions of red-green that we're seeing, but I definitely think that it's one that's very interesting. And with that, we move into the final one, which is Dewar Dia, Chief of the Bright Fox Tribe. Very similar ability here. Whenever Dewar Dia moves into a forest, you may teleport him to a forest you control. If you do, he gains 1/1. Also, is 6 Faeria 6/6, very good stats to start off with, and the potential to just kite around the board until it's too big for your opponent to deal with. Was changed into the Rakuen synergy, given that subtype tag on here. Although I don't think that makes too much of a difference, because the 4 forest cost is kind of heavy to play a Rakuen deck and have Dewar Dia in there. Now it is just a one-off, so maybe you go to 2, and whenever you need to, you eventually go 3 and 4. But I just don't think it's worth playing in that style of a deck. Some kind of a mid-range green. This is actually very strong because of that ability to kite all over the board. You can run Grove Callers and get a couple movements. Maybe run some type of green-yellow. Now, again, that is very heavy in terms of land requirements, but that does potentially give you extra movements in the same turn. Get those extra teleports, get the extra buffs, take some value trades. I think it's very interesting. I don't currently see an archetype with Dewar Dia as kind of the center. I should say Dewar Dia and Vulpine as the centerpieces, being something that's pushed to the forefront. But because Dewar Dia is just a one-off because it's a legendary, it could very easily fit into one of the greens that we're probably going to see very prevalent in the meta. All right. That's going to do it for my card review for part 2. Definitely interested to hear what you guys have to say, so leave me a comment down below or hit me up in either the Faeria or Metagamingtv Discords. You can find me streaming on Twitch. It's twitch.tv/Metagamingtv. Follow me on Twitter at Skorch13. Definitely keep your eyes peeled. Will be probably about a month from now for my looking back Faeria Resurgence Revisited style video. You can also check out my Fall of Everlife Revisited. That one's up on our YouTube as well as checking out my card reveal, which I just did recently. I'm very, very interested in what Resurgence is going to do to the meta now that it's fully out. We've had a couple different decks come about because of part 1, and I think part 2 really pushes a few different archetypes, as well as, I think, bringing the Resurgence back to a couple others. That's going to do it for me for today, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.